Engines have been around in Yu-Gi-Oh for a very long time. An example of this would be the Torgai and Sangan engine that was around during the Zexal era. However, now it's gone to a point where cards from archetypes are being used as engines, and for me personally, I think it's a bad thing for Yu-Gi-Oh! So in this video, I'll be explaining why I think engines are bad for the game, as well as why I think they're unavoidable. Without any more intros, let's get into this. Alright, let's get the obvious out of the way. The first problem I have with engines is how they make the format stale. You have every deck doing the same playstyle over and over again, and it just takes away the fun of the game. Look at the deck list that I got from YCS Charlotte. You can see every deck using the Adventurer engine and some using the Destroy Phoenix engine. This kinda takes away deck creativity, as now every deck is just these engines than their own cards. I feel like a lot of people would agree with this, but a format is way more fun when you have decks doing their own thing. An example of this would be last format. Even though we had the Destroy Phoenix engine, not every deck was playing it. Both Sword Soul and Bird Up were doing their own plays. Sword Soul went for its Synchros and Protos, meanwhile Bird Up went for Revolt, Samorg, Draco Future, and Robin. The only top decks that played Destroy Phoenix were Sky Striker, Invoked, and Drytron, but even with that, the format was still diverse, and I remember a lot of people enjoying that. This all changed though when we got Grand Creators, and every deck started playing the Adventurer engine. To me, engines take away somewhat of other decks' identities, which leads them into the same playstyle that we're currently seeing now. This ends up leading us into the boring format that we're dealing with. Something else that I want to mention here is how easily your opponent can transition into these engines. I think a lot of people can agree that it's really unfair that after your opponent burns you of all your resources, they then can switch into these engines, and at that point it will be hard as hell to beat them with their newly established board. Some of you might say, well then build a better board or play more hand traps. The problem with that argument is that your opponent can bait out all of them with their regular deck's combos, and you will run out of disruptions eventually, and once you do, they'll switch into these engines. Here, just look at this Orcus replay I got from CapG's channel when he used to do replays.
Oh, this is the plot twist, boys. He says, Cap, no problem. I'll just go into my Orcus combo. Turns out even Yosenju Melodious is an Orcus deck. Literally every deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! is an Orcus deck, man.
I've also seen duels where people play both Verta Anaconda as well as Hauki Fibrax, and if one of them gets negated, they can then transition into the other. After all, both of them are pretty broken, and they both provide a huge benefit. Though, I do believe that decks shouldn't have this ability unless it's built into the archetype, because it can make a really unfair game state. In fact, my friend Smitty introduced me to a guy who plays in the OCG, and he told me that the biggest problem people had with Dragoon is that people summoned him when their opponent was low on resources. And we know that when you're low on resources, it's almost impossible to beat Dragoon, kinda proving my point that these transitions are unfair. Another point that I want to bring up is that these engines hurt their own respective decks in two ways. One way is with the ban list, as we know that eventually Konami will hit these engines, as for the reasons I said before, and sometimes it can hurt the archetype that the cards belong to. An example would be Speedroid Terratop. When that card went to 1, it really hurt the consistency of Speedroids. Then there's also Brilliant Fusion. Now that card's banned, Gem Knights kinda have a harder time bringing out their boss monsters like Lady Brilliant Diamond and Master Diamond. You gotta feel bad for these decks, as their best cards got hit, but it wasn't even because of them. To add on to this point, I feel that if these engines are brand new, meaning that they came out the gate like this, Konami will stop supporting them because they're afraid that the new cards will be incorporated into these engines. This mainly happens when the archetype is immediately being used as an engine the moment it comes out. A good example of this would be the Adventurer engine. Once we got Grand Creators, people started using it as an engine, and because of that, Adventurers kinda stopped getting support. This is shown in Power of the Elements as they got nothing. Though, you could probably make that argument for any deck that became meta the moment it came out, like Eldritch and Adamantipator, as they only got one support after their success, but even still, I believe that if the Adventurer engine never happened, then they would have gotten more support because pure Adventure is not that strong of a deck, so they could have used more cards. Now, after hearing everything, some of you might say that Konami should really try to stop this from happening again in the future. Remember that I said at the beginning of the video that this is an unsolvable problem? Well, that's because it is. To be honest with you, although Konami deserves crap for some things, when it comes to engines, I really think that part of the problem is us, the player base. I know some of you might not like that answer, but hear me out. You see, we as Yu-Gi-Oh players have the ability to break cards way beyond what Konami expected, and has been going on since the DM era. An example of this would be pre-errata Future Fusion. The card was supposed to be used as fusion support, but we ended up using as Painful Choice 2.0, which led to it getting banned. There are a couple of reasons on why these kind of things happen. 1. There were over 10,000 cards in this game, and we can use every single one of them except for those that are on the ban list since we don't have set rotation. 2. There are over 1 million players and there are R&D testers at Konami. They can't predict every play that we can think of. In fact, I have a question for all of you. When Konami was making Infernoble Knights, do you really think they thought of Smoke Grenade when designing the archetype? No, they didn't. In fact, there was no way for them to see it coming, because Smoke Grenade is a 15-year-old card, and I highly doubt they have the time to R&D test every combo when making new cards, since in a large company they have a tight schedule. Do you see my point? Konami R&D can't safeguard us against every degenerate combo that we can come up with. This doesn't just apply to engines, but it applies to a lot of bad things that have happened since the beginning. The reason why we can go beyond Konami's expectation is that we have all the time in the world to think of these combos, and we can go over every card that we have. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with engines? Well, I'm going to be going over some engines that we had over the years and give my personal thoughts on whose fault is it on why it happened. Starting off with the Brilliant Fusion engine, I believe that it's mostly our fault on why it happened. Why do I think that? Well, I saw Yishon's video on engines, and one of his first points was that Konami intentionally made Brilliant Fusion to become an engine, and maybe I misinterpreted what he said, but that's just something I got when I watched his video. And to be honest with you, I don't fully agree with this. As I said before, I believe that Konami made Brilliant Fusion so that Gem Knights can summon their boss monsters more easily. They even show this in the anime. Here, just watch this clip.
ブリリアントフュージョンを発動。このカードはデッキのモンスターを融合素材としてジェムナイト1体を融合召喚する。共に一つとならん融合召喚。これが私の真のエース。輝きの淑女ジェムナイトレディブリリアントダイヤ。
They never had the intention of making this card an engine. That's just something we came up with when we got the card. Some of you might say, well, they should have put more restrictions on it, but you gotta remember that it was during the Arc V era when they started adding power creep into fusion spells. Konami didn't fully grasp the whole cost and restriction things on fusion spells at the time, so that's why I believe most of the blame is on us, because we exploited what they were trying to do, and that's making better fusion cards. Moving on to the next engine, and that's Dragoon. With this one, I would say is 100% Konami's fault. I feel like we can all agree that both Dragoon and Verte were poorly designed cards, with Dragoon being over-designed to hell and back, meanwhile Verte is basically a better version of Instant Fusion. These cards clearly shouldn't have been designed the way they were. Dragoon didn't need this much protection, and Verte should have just supported Predator plants as it was meant to be, but it is what it is. Now, let's move on to the next one. The third engine we're talking about is the Destroy Phoenix engine, and this one I think is 100% our fault. When it comes to this engine, I feel that people have it a bit misconstrued. What do I mean by this? Well, I always see comments saying that Konami should have looked back at Dragoon and not have made Destroy Phoenix as powerful as he is. And to me, whenever someone says that, I just ask, so what do you want his effect to be then? Do you just want this card to suck? You just don't want Destiny heroes to have a good boss monster? Do you want them to be like Dual Avatar where all their fusions are bad? Is that really fair? That just because of Dragoon, all fusion boss monsters from now on should be terrible? I highly doubt Konami would do that, and I just think that's a bad idea. Also, the reason why this engine happened isn't because of Destroy Phoenix. It's mainly Fusion Destiny's fault, but you can't blame Konami on that either because the card came out 2 years ago. It was made to summon things like Dominance, Destiny End Dragoon, and other Destiny Heroes fusions. Honestly, this was unavoidable. Even if DPE sucked, if Destiny Heroes got another fusion in the future that was good, then this engine still would have happened. And remember what I said about Konami R&D? That they don't have all the time to test to see if these cards would work in other decks? This is especially true when they're designing legacy support, so they couldn't foresee this. That's why I believe that this engine is our fault. Alright, I spoke enough about this one, let's move on to the last one. So the last engine we'll talk about is the Adventure engine. Now this one, I think it's kind of our fault too, as well as Konami's, but mostly our fault. We never had an engine like this one before, so once again, there was no way for Konami to foresee it. This deck was supposed to be its own thing just like every other new deck that is made, but we exploited it by turning it into an engine. Also, I remember that when this archetype was first revealed, everyone laughed at it, calling it the worst thing to come out of Grand Creators. Now look how that turned out. This kind of shows that even we don't see this as an engine at first glance, and then that we end up criticizing Konami even though we're the ones who came up with this. Though, I will say that the lack of restrictions is kind of Konami's fault, but even still, this engine was not their intention, which is why I believe that most of the blame is on us. But in general, when it comes to engines in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's mainly both sides' fault. Konami designs the cards the way that they are, and we're the ones that exploits it beyond what Konami expected. I can already hear some of you saying that maybe Konami should hire someone that actually knows how to play the game. And to that, let me introduce you to Jerome McHale, the head of R&D in the TCG. This guy's been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Since the moment it came to the West. He was writing articles for Meta.com since the beginning, so he knows this game very well. Jerome working for Konami kinda shows that even if the employee knows how to play the game, they can't prevent all the bad crap that happens. To prove my point even further, Jerome made the Danger archetype, and we can agree that Dangers were a huge mistake, but when he designed the cards, he couldn't predict that the Danger engine would happen. So this fully proves my point that even if the employee knows how to play the game, they can't safeguard us against these engines. I do want to say this though, Konami is trying to not make these engines happen, as in Power of the Elements, Gem Knight's got new support and their new fusion spell is a way more balanced version of Brilliant Fusion, so they're trying to avoid these engines, but still, don't expect them to stop every future engine, that's just impossible. Well, there you go, I gave my thoughts on why I think engines hurt the game, as well as why they're unavoidable. I want to hear what you guys have to say. Do you think that engines are bad for the game? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.